By the time Abigail Hart raised the shotgun, the stranger had already taken off his hat. He stood at the foot of her porch with dust to his knees, a bedroll over one shoulder, and a 7-year-old girl hidden behind the back of his coat. The man looked at the gun, then at Abigail. Then he said very quietly, "Mrs. Pritchard told me you were looking for a husband." Abigail almost laughed, almost. But the little girl leaned just far enough around the stranger's coat for Abigail to see her face. Her cheeks were hollow. Her braids had come loose. Both hands were wrapped around a dented blue tea tin as though it contained the last safe thing in the world. The child looked at the dark windows of the farmhouse. Then she whispered 6 words. "Please don't send us away again." The shotgun barrel dropped an inch. Not because Abigail trusted the man. She did not. Not because she believed some traveling stranger could become a husband before supper. She did not believe that either. She lowered the gun because the little girl had not asked for food, money, or a bed. She had asked not to be rejected, and Abigail Hart knew exactly what it felt like to stand outside a door and wait for someone else to decide whether you belonged. The year was 1887, and the eastern Colorado plains had gone nearly 4 months without a soaking rain. The grass around Cottonwood Ridge Ranch had turned the color of old rope. The creek was a thin ribbon of mud. Every afternoon, the wind pushed dust through the cracks in the farmhouse walls and laid it across Abigail's table like a second tablecloth. Her father had left her 160 acres, 58 head of cattle, a wind pump that groaned through the night, and a banknote due before the first hard freeze. He had also left her his stubbornness. That part, at least, still worked. For 2 years Abigail had run the ranch alone. She had learned to set a broken fence post, pull a breech calf, bargain with grain merchants, and sleep lightly enough to hear coyotes circling the calving pen. The men in town called her capable when they wanted to be polite. They called her foolish when they thought she could not hear. 3 weeks earlier, after one hired hand disappeared with half a month's wages and another quit because he would not take orders from a woman, Abigail had pinned a notice at Pritchard's Mercantile. Steady ranch hand wanted, winter room and board, possible share in spring profits, no drinkers, no drifters. Mrs. Pritchard, who had buried 2 husbands and considered subtlety a waste of good breath, had apparently summarized the notice in her own way. Abigail kept the shotgun across her body. "What's your name?" "Silas Boone. And the girl?" "My daughter Nora. Where's her mother?" The question landed harder than Abigail intended. Silas did not flinch, but something changed around his eyes. "Buried outside Salina." The child tightened her grip on the tea tin. Abigail looked down the road behind them. No wagon, no horse, no mule, nothing but their footprints fading into the evening dust. "You walked here, last 14 miles. From where?" "Rail stop at Brush." "That is not what I asked." Silas held her gaze. "From a place that hired me until the owner learned I had a child. Before that, from another place that paid me in promises. Before that, Kansas." Abigail glanced at Nora's boots. The toes had been stuffed with cloth, but one sole had split nearly from heel to arch. "How old is she?" 7. "I am 8 next month," Nora corrected from behind his coat. It was the first sign that fear had not swallowed her whole. Abigail shifted the gun toward the wall. "Your wife died how long ago?" 18 months. "And since then?" "I have taken whatever work kept us together." "Why not leave the girl with family?" Silas's jaw tightened. "Because she is my family." The answer came fast. Too fast to be practiced, too sharp to be convenient. Abigail understood sharp answers. They usually protected a wound. She opened the screen door. "I have stew. You can eat on the porch." Silas shook his head. "I can split wood first." "You can eat first." "I do not take charity." Abigail looked at the little girl's sunken cheeks. "Then call it an interview." Silas did not smile, but Nora's eyes lifted. Abigail brought out 2 bowls of beef stew, half a loaf of yesterday's bread, and a jar of water cooled in the spring house. She set them on the small porch table. There were only 2 chairs. Silas gave one to Nora and sat on the step. The child ate carefully at first, as though someone might count each spoonful. Then hunger took over. She finished the stew, wiped the bowl clean with bread, and hid the last piece inside the tea tin. Silas noticed. "Nora." She froze. "You do not need to save it." Her eyes dropped. Abigail said nothing. She cut another thick slice and placed it beside the first. Nora stared at it. "For tomorrow," Abigail said. The little girl closed the lid of the tin. That was when Abigail made the first mistake. She looked at them and imagined what the house might sound like with another pair of footsteps in it. She corrected herself at once. 1 week, she said. You sleep in the bunkhouse. Nora takes the small room off the kitchen. You work from first light until the evening bell. At the end of 7 days, I decide whether you stay. Silas stood. And the husband part? There is no husband part. A shadow of humor crossed his tired face. That may be a relief to both of us. Abigail picked up the shotgun again. Do not make me regret the stew. Silas put on his hat. Mom, regret is one thing I know how to avoid. The next morning, Abigail woke before dawn and found the bunkhouse empty. For one cold second, she thought he had taken food and run. Then she heard metal striking metal near the north pasture. Silas had removed the broken blades from the wind pump and laid them in a neat line beside the tower. He had already climbed 30 feet with a rope looped around his waist. Abigail stood below with her hands on her hips. That pump has been complaining for a year. Pumps complain when nobody listens. You always talk to machinery, only when people are less reasonable. From the kitchen doorway, Nora covered a smile. By breakfast, Silas had straightened 2 bent blades, replaced a worn pin with one he shaped from an old wagon bolt, and adjusted the tail so the wheel faced the wind instead of fighting it. The pump began to move, slowly at first, then steadily. Clear water spilled into the trough in a strong silver stream. Abigail stared. The well had not produced that much in months. Silas climbed down. The lower pipe is still drawing air. It will fail again. How soon? Could be tomorrow. Could be after the first freeze. You always bring good news? No, I bring useful news. That afternoon he repaired the West Corral gate without being asked. The next day he reset a leaning section of fence and found the reason Abigail's best mare, Juniper, had begun striking anyone who approached from the left. A burr had worked deep beneath the edge of the halter. Silas did not force the animal. He stood in the dust for nearly an hour, speaking in a voice too low for Abigail to hear, until Juniper stopped trembling. Then he cut the halter loose and removed the burr with his fingers. The mare lowered her head against his chest. Abigail watched from the barn shadows. Every man who had ever tried to impress her had made sure she saw the effort. Silas acted as though work only mattered when the work was finished. That made him harder to read. It also made him dangerous in a way she had not expected. He was becoming useful. Nora was quieter. She followed her father from chore to chore, never more than a few steps away. When he climbed a ladder, she stood below. When he entered the barn, she waited at the door. When he rode out with Abigail to check the south fence, Nora sat on the porch with the tea tin in her lap and watched the horizon until both riders returned. At night, she slept in the small room beside the kitchen, but the lamp remained lit. On the 3rd night, Abigail heard a soft scrape. She found Nora dragging a chair across the floor toward the front window. "What are you doing?" Nora stopped. "Nothing. Nothing usually makes less noise." The girl climbed onto the chair and stared toward the black shape of the bunkhouse. "I was checking." "Checking what?" "That Papa is still there." Abigail looked at the child's bare feet. "He is. He left before I woke once." Silas had told Abigail that Nora's mother died in Salina. He had not told her anything else. Where did he go? To find a doctor. And he came back? Nora nodded. "Then why are you worried?" The child pressed one palm to the glass. Mama did not. Abigail had no answer that could survive a sentence like that. She carried Nora back to bed, tucked the quilt around her shoulders, and turned the lamp lower. At the door, Nora whispered, "Will you make him leave after 7 days?" Abigail looked toward the wall between the small bedroom and the kitchen. "I have not decided." Nora nodded as if she had expected nothing better. The 7th day arrived with a hard red sunrise and a smell of dust that made the cattle restless. Abigail rode the property with Silas beside her. He had made a list of everything the ranch needed before winter. The list was longer than her arm. 200 feet of new fence wire, a brace for the barn's east wall, 3 loads of hay they could not afford, a rebuilt pump cylinder, a deeper catch basin below the spring, roof shingles, salt oats, medicine, time. Abigail folded the paper. "You left out money. I assumed you knew. I know exactly how much I have. How much? That is not your concern. It becomes my concern if I am expected to keep cattle alive through January. You are expected to do the work I give you." Silas looked across the brittle pasture. "That is not enough." Abigail pulled her horse to a stop. "Excuse me? You can give a man orders until the herd dies. The cattle will not care which one of us was in charge." The wind pressed Abigail's skirt against the saddle. No hired hand had spoken to her that way since her father was alive. "You have been here 7 days." "Yes. And you think that gives you a claim on my decisions?" "No. Then what gives you the right?" Silas looked toward Nora. A small figure on the porch half a mile away. Nothing gives me the right, the facts give me the reason. Abigail hated him a little for saying it. She hated him more because he was correct. The ranch had enough hay for perhaps 6 weeks if the winter stayed mild. Colorado winters did not make promises. Silas pointed toward a low ravine beyond the east pasture. What is down there? Cottonwood wash. Water. Not since I was a girl. Your father ever dig it out? He said the spring moved. Springs do not move far. Dirt does. Abigail studied the ravine. You think there is water under that clay? I think your cottonwoods are still green. They rode down and dismounted. At the base of the wash, a line of cottonwood trees held more color than anything else on the ranch. Silas knelt, pushed aside dead leaves, and dug with his knife. 6 inches down, the soil darkened. At 10 inches, it clung to the blade. At 14, water gathered in the hole. Abigail felt something inside her chest shift. How long to open it? With a shovel. 2 weeks. We do not have 2 weeks. With both of us, 5 days. Nora, she can carry stones. Nora carried stones. She also carried water, sorted roots, collected tools, and talked for the first time without waiting for someone to ask a question. She told Abigail that the blue tea tin had belonged to her mother. Inside were 3 pearl buttons, a paper bird folded from a church program, a faded yellow ribbon, 1 brass thimble, and the piece of bread she had saved the first night. Why keep the bread? Abigail asked. Nora touched the hard crust. So I remember there was extra. Abigail turned away before the child could see her face. For 5 days they dug into the ravine. The work stripped the skin from their hands, clay packed beneath their nails. Silas built a wooden trough from old fence boards and lined the weakest seams with canvas. Abigail widened the channel toward the lower pasture. On the 4th afternoon, the hole collapsed and buried Silas to the waist. Abigail dropped her shovel and clawed at the clay until he could breathe. When they finally pulled him free, both of them lay on the ground gasping. Nora stood above them, white with fear. Papa? Silas lifted one muddy hand. Still here. Nora burst into tears. He sat up and pulled her against him. Abigail watched them hold each other in the bottom of the dry wash. She understood then that Nora's fear was not childish imagination. The girl had lived too close to disappearance. On the 5th day, water began to run. Not much. A thin stream, clear and cold, slipping over the packed clay and into Silas's wooden trough, then more. By sunset, enough water had gathered for 3 cattle at a time to drink. Abigail stood ankle-deep in mud. Silas leaned on his shovel beside her. That buys us something, he said. How much? A chance. Abigail looked up the slope. Nora was placing 3 flat stones beside the spring, 1 large, 1 medium, 1 small. What is she doing? Silas smiled. Making us a family of rocks, I suppose. The word family passed between them and stayed there. Abigail climbed out of the wash. You can remain through winter, Silas followed. As a ranch hand? As a ranch hand. With room and board? Yes. Possible share in spring profits? If there are spring profits. And still no husband part. Abigail looked at him. Do you want the job or not? I want the job, he said it calmly. But that night, when Abigail entered the kitchen, she found a 3rd chair at the table. Silas had repaired it from pieces of 2 broken ones. Nora sat in the middle chair. Abigail almost told him to put it back in the shed. Instead, she served supper. Weeks passed. The new spring did not save the ranch by itself, but it changed what was possible. Silas built a covered cistern so less water vanished into the dry air. He traded repair work at neighboring farms for hay. Abigail sold 6 weak steers before the market dropped again and used the money to buy winter feed. They began rising before dawn and finishing after dark. Nora learned to gather eggs without frightening the hens. She named every barn cat, including one that clearly belonged to nobody. She collected smooth stones for the windowsill. She helped Abigail knead bread and always made 1 tiny loaf that she called the traveling loaf. Where is it traveling? Abigail asked. Nowhere yet. At first, Nora asked permission before every bite, then only before second helpings, then not at all. That was how Abigail measured trust. Not in smiles, in appetite. One evening, a wagon rolled into the yard carrying Mrs. Pritchard 2 sacks of flour and enough opinions for a county meeting. She looked Silas up and down. So this is the husband. No, Abigail said. Not yet, Mrs. Pritchard replied. Silas coughed into his fist. Nora laughed so hard milk came through her nose. It was the first full laugh Abigail had heard from her. The sound filled the kitchen, struck the walls, and seemed to wake the house from a long sleep. That night, after Nora went to bed, Abigail found Silas on the porch repairing the split sole of the child's boot. He had cut a patch from his own. You will ruin yours, Abigail said. Mine still have another season. No, they do not. Then perhaps we will both learn to float. She sat on the porch step. For a while neither spoke. The sky was wide and black, and the stars looked close enough to catch in a tin cup. Silas pushed the needle through leather. Why are you alone? He asked. Abigail's shoulders stiffened. That is a dangerous question for a man sleeping in my bunkhouse. You asked about my wife the first night. I had a shotgun. I remember. She watched him work. There was someone, she said at last. Years ago. His name was Everett. He liked the ranch when he thought my father would hand it to him. He liked me when I agreed with his plans. Silas waited. When father got sick, Everett offered to sell half the herd and move east. I said no. 2 weeks later he took the money we had saved for our wedding and left without saying goodbye. How much? Enough to teach me the price of believing a promise. Silas tied off the thread. Not every promise is a lie. No, some are simply more expensive than they sound. He handed her the repaired boot. My wife used to say I could fix anything made of wood, iron, or leather. What about people? She said I made those worse before I made them better. Abigail smiled before she could stop herself. What was her name? Margaret. What happened? Silas looked out at the dark fields. Scarlet fever came through the rail camp. The doctor reached us late. Margaret knew before I did that she would not live. His voice thinned. She made me promise Nora would never be given away. Her sisters wanted to take the girl, but not me. Said a laboring man had no business raising a daughter on the road. And you refused. I promised. The word was quiet, solid, not spoken for effect. Abigail looked down at the small boot in her hands. How many places sent you away? 3 after Kansas. 1 before we even crossed the yard. Another let us stay 2 nights, then said Nora ate too much. The last man said children distracted workers. Abigail remembered the saved bread. Nora had not been hiding food because she was greedy. She had been preparing to leave. The next morning, Abigail rode to town and bought a pair of boots in Nora's size. She told herself it was part of the child's room and board. Nora knew better. She held the boots against her chest and asked, "Do I have to give them back if we go?" Abigail answered too quickly, "You are not going anywhere today." The child's face dimmed at the last word, today. Abigail heard it too, but she did not repair the sentence. That was the trouble with guarded people. They often recognized the wound they were causing and still chose the weapon they knew. By late September, the prairie had become a field of tinder. The grass snapped underfoot. Dust rose from cattle trails and hung in the air after the herd passed. Every horizon carried a faint brown haze. Silas began plowing a firebreak around the house and barn. Abigail watched the narrow blade cut through dead grass. That will cost us grazing. Fire costs more. There has not been a grass fire here in 12 years. Silas looked at the sky. The prairie does not keep a calendar. For 3 days they turned black soil around the buildings. On the 4th day the wind changed. It came from the south, hot and sudden. At noon Nora pointed toward the horizon. A dark line was rising beyond the Miller place. At first it looked like weather. Then Abigail saw birds lifting out of it. Not flying, fleeing, fire, Silas said. The word changed the entire ranch. Abigail ran for the bell and struck it hard enough to split the afternoon. Silas turned the cattle toward the grazed north pasture. Abigail soaked blankets at the trough and dragged them to the barn. Nora carried buckets until the first ash began to fall. Then the sky went copper. The fire moved faster than a horse at a trot, eating the dry grass in long orange waves. "Cellar," Abigail ordered. Nora stood frozen. Now Silas grabbed the girl by the shoulders. "Take your tin and go below. Do not come out until one of us opens the door." Nora nodded, ran inside, then stopped. "My traveling loaf. Leave it." "But leave it." She disappeared into the house. Abigail and Silas worked the fire break with wet sacks and shovels. Sparks leaped across the black soil. One caught the hay wagon. Another landed on the barn roof. Flames climbed the shingles. Silas ran for the ladder. "The horses!" Abigail shouted. "I will get them. You take the roof. I will take the horses." Inside the barn, smoke dropped from the rafters in a dark sheet. Juniper screamed against her stall. Abigail cut the halter and slapped the mare toward the door. 2 geldings followed. The 4th horse would not move. A burning shingle fell behind it. Abigail wrapped her sleeve over her mouth and reached for the latch. Then she heard a sound from the loft, coughing. Small, terrified. "Nora?" No answer. Abigail looked toward the house. The cellar door stood open. She climbed the ladder into smoke. Nora was on her knees near the hay, one hand wrapped around the blue tea tin and the other clutching the traveling loaf. "I told you to stay below. I forgot Mama the tin. Abigail understood. She grabbed Nora and pulled her against her chest. The loft stairs disappeared behind flame. Below them, the trapped horse kicked through a stall board. Outside, Silas shouted Nora's name. Abigail crossed to the hay door at the far end of the loft. It opened 12 feet above the ground. Too high for a child. Too high for a safe jump. Smoke closed around them. Nora began to cry. Please do not make Papa leave me. Abigail held the girl's face between both hands. Listen to me, your father is not leaving you. How do you know? Because Abigail needed it to be true. Because neither am I. She pushed open the hay door. Silas appeared below through the smoke. He had dragged the water trough beneath the loft and thrown wet blankets over the side. Drop her! Abigail looked at the flames crawling over the rafters. Nora, close your eyes. The child wrapped both arms around Abigail's neck. I cannot. Yes, you can. I am scared. So am I. That surprised Nora enough to make her look up. Abigail kissed her forehead. Being scared does not mean we stay in the fire. She lowered Nora through the opening as far as she could. Silas stood in the trough, arms raised. Now, Abigail, let go. Nora fell. Silas caught her against his chest and went backward into the water. Abigail jumped after them. She landed hard on the edge of the trough, pain tearing through her ankle, then rolled into the mud. The barn roof collapsed seconds later. Silas covered Nora with his body. Abigail lay in the dirt, unable to breathe. For a terrible moment, the whole world was flame and ash. Then the fire reached the plowed break. It crossed in places. They beat it back. It crossed again near the chicken yard. Mrs. Pritchard's sons arrived with wet hides. The millers came with shovels. The blacksmith brought a team and dragged the burning hay wagon away from the house. By sunset, the fire had passed north. Cottonwood Ridge was still standing, barely. The barn was half gone. 20 tons of stored hay had burned. 7 cattle were missing. Abigail's ankle had swollen inside her boot. Silas's hands were blistered and the back of his coat was scorched black. Nora sat beneath a blanket beside the trough, the blue tea tin in her lap. The traveling loaf had become a lump of wet dough. She would not let it go. That night, all 3 slept in the kitchen because the air in the bedroom smelled of smoke. Nora lay on a pallet between the stove and the table. Silas sat awake beside her. Abigail watched him from the 3rd chair. You saved her, he said. I sent her to the cellar. She went back. I should have checked. You went into a burning barn. So would you. I am her father. Abigail looked at the sleeping child. I did not think about whose daughter she was. Silas's face changed. Not much. Enough. He reached across the table, then stopped before touching Abigail's hand. Outside, small fires still glowed along the ridge. Inside, Nora slept without the lamp. The fire should have brought them closer. Instead, it exposed the truth they had all been avoiding. They had enough hay left for less than a month. The barn could not shelter the herd through a blizzard. The banknote was due in 23 days. And no matter how much water ran through the reopened spring, water could not feed cattle. 2 mornings later, a letter arrived from the rail yard in Fort Morgan. Silas read it beside the woodpile. Abigail watched from the window. He folded it once, then again. That evening he placed it beside her plate. A freight company was offering him a winter position repairing wagons and loading equipment. The pay was steady. The company provided a small room near the yard. There was a schoolhouse within walking distance. When did you apply? Abigail asked. Before I came here. You said you wanted this job. I did. Then why keep the letter? Because wanting a thing does not make it responsible. The word struck her like an accusation. Responsible for whom? For Nora, and what is she here? Silas looked towards the small wardroom. Happy. Then why leave? Because happiness does not fill a hayloft. Abigail pushed back from the table. You think I do not know what the ranch needs? I think you know exactly. Then say what you mean. Silas stood. If I stay, I am another mouth, another wage, another person you will try to save while pretending you need nobody. Abigail's face went cold. I did not ask you to save me. No, you only let me rebuild your pump, open your spring, trade for your hay, fight your fire, and put my child at your table. You were paid. Not for what this became. The room went silent. Nora stood in the doorway. Neither adult had heard her. The blue tea tin hung at her side. Are we going away? She asked. Silas turned. Nora, did I eat too much? No. Was it because of the fire? No, sweetheart. She looked at Abigail. Was it because I went back? Abigail felt every wall she had ever built rise at once. She could tell the child to stay. She could ask Silas not to take the rail job. She could admit the house no longer felt like hers when they were gone. Instead, fear chose for her. Your father has to do what is best for you. Nora's face emptied, not shattered, emptied. That was worse. She nodded, went back into the small room, and closed the door with careful hands. Silas stared at Abigail. "You are very good at surviving." His voice was low. "But you do not know the difference between surviving and living." He went after his daughter. Abigail remained at the table with 3 chairs and no one sitting in 2 of them. The next week was the loneliest the ranch had ever felt. Silas still worked. He repaired what remained of the barn. He helped locate 5 of the missing cattle. He cut usable boards from the burned walls and stacked them by length. But every task now had the shape of goodbye. Nora packed her tea tin. The new boots Abigail had bought remained beside the bed. She wore the old pair with the split sole. Abigail noticed. She said nothing. On the morning before Silas was supposed to leave, the sky turned the color of lead. The temperature dropped 30 degrees before noon. Cattle gathered with their backs to the north. Silas looked at the clouds. Storm is coming. Snow, more than snow. The first flakes arrived sideways. By dusk, the wind had become a living thing. The repaired wind pump vanished behind white. Fence lines disappeared. The cattle in the north pasture broke through a weak section and scattered toward Cottonwood Wash. If they reached the open flats beyond it, the storm would bury them. Abigail pulled on her coat. Silas blocked the door. "Your ankle is not ready. My cattle are out. You can barely put weight on it. Move." Nora stood behind him. "Please do not go." Abigail looked at the child. There it was again, the fear that every departure might become permanent. Silas knelt. "We have to bring the herd into the south cut. You stay with Mrs. Pritchard." "No." "Nora, no. Every time people leave, they say they will come back." Silas took her face in his blistered hands. "I have come back every time. What if the snow is different?" He had no answer. Abigail did. She removed the red wool scarf from her neck and tied it around Nora's shoulders. "Then you hold this for me." Nora touched the scarf. "It was my mother's," Abigail said. "I have never left it with anyone." The girl looked up. "That means I have to give it back." "Yes, when we come home." Nora swallowed and nodded. Mrs. Pritchard arrived in a covered wagon with her sons and carried Nora away through the storm. Then Abigail and Silas rode north. Visibility dropped to less than 20 yards. Ice formed on the horses' manes. Wind drove snow beneath Abigail's collar and into her gloves. Her injured ankle burned each time the horse stumbled. They found the first cattle pressed against the ravine bank. Silas turned them south. They found 12 more near the open spring, confused by the new drifts. The water still ran beneath a skin of ice. That thin stream had become a landmark in a white world. They pushed the cattle toward the sheltered cut. Then Juniper stopped. Her ears turned west. Somewhere beyond the snow came a low, broken bawl, a calf. Abigail looked at Silas. "We have 36 head accounted for. The rest may already be south. That calf is not." They followed the sound into the wash. A young heifer had fallen through the edge of the spring channel. One hind leg was trapped between 2 stones. Her calf stood nearby, shaking. Silas dismounted. "The bank is giving way. We can pull her." "Not with your ankle. Stop saying that." "Stop pretending bone listens to pride." He looped a rope around the heifer while Abigail steadied the calf. The bank collapsed. Silas dropped waist-deep into freezing water and mud. The horse pulled back. The rope snapped tight. For one instant, Silas disappeared beneath the bank. Nora's 6 words struck Abigail with the force of prayer. "Please don't send us away again." Abigail threw herself from the saddle. Pain exploded through her leg. She crawled to the edge, found Silas's arm and pulled. The mud held him. The current dragged at his coat. "Let go of the heifer," she shouted. "The rope is caught. Then cut it." "My knife." Abigail reached beneath the water, found the rope, and sawed through it with her own blade. The heifer kicked free. Silas surfaced, choking. Together they crawled onto the bank. For a moment neither could move. Snow buried the shoulders of their coats. The calf pressed against its mother. Silas rolled onto his back. "You should have stayed at the house." Abigail laughed once, half from fear and half from fury. "You are still trying to give me orders. I am still your ranch hand." "No." The word came out before she could stop it. Silas turned his head. The storm screamed around them. Abigail grabbed the front of his wet coat. "You are not my ranch hand. What am I?" She had spent years refusing to need anyone because needing had once cost her everything she trusted. Now the man in front of her was freezing in the mud because he had stayed to save a calf that did not belong to him on a ranch that was not his. And the child waiting in town believed love was only another word people used before leaving. Abigail had no patience left for fear. "You are the man who put a third chair at my table," she said. "You are the father of the girl I went into a fire to save. You are the fool who found water under dead trees and thought a woman with a shotgun needed useful news." Silas stared at her through the snow. And if you take that railroad job, I will understand." His face fell. "But I will not pretend I want you to go." For the first time since he arrived, Silas looked completely unguarded. "I never wanted to go." "Then why were you leaving?" "Because I thought you would rather lose us than ask us to stay." Abigail closed her eyes. "That sounds like me." "It does." She opened them. "Stay. Through winter?" "No." His breath caught. Abigail tightened her grip on his coat. "Stay when the roof leaks. Stay when the cattle break fence. Stay when Nora wakes at night. Stay when I am angry. Stay when you are. Stay when spring comes and there is profit. And stay if there is none." Silas looked at her as though the storm had gone quiet. "Are we discussing the husband part? We are freezing in a ditch. Do not become charming now." He laughed. It was the wrong place for laughter. That made it perfect. They got the heifer out, found the remaining cattle, and reached the south cut after midnight. Mrs. Pritchard met them at the farmhouse with Nora wrapped in Abigail's red scarf. The child ran through the snow. Silas dropped to his knees. Nora struck his chest with both fists before throwing her arms around his neck. "You came back." "I told you." She turned to Abigail. Abigail held out one hand. "My scarf." Nora clutched it. "You said when you came home." "We did." The girl studied her face, then looked at Silas, then back at Abigail. "Are we still leaving tomorrow?" Silas did not answer for her. This time, Abigail did not hide behind careful words. "No." Nora's eyes widened. "No, because of the storm?" "No." "Because Papa is working?" "No, because I did not eat too much." Abigail knelt despite the pain in her ankle. "No one at this table will ever have to earn the right to belong." Nora's mouth trembled. "Even if I get scared, especially then." The girl wrapped the red scarf around all three of them. Winter did not become easy because they chose each other. The barn still needed rebuilding. The bank still wanted its money. 2 cows were lost to the blizzard, and 3 more came through thin. Silas took repair work in town during the coldest weeks. Abigail sold handmade tack and 2 acres along the southern boundary to a neighbor who had asked for years. Mrs. Pritchard organized a barn raising and claimed it had nothing to do with sentiment. By Christmas, the herd had shelter. By February, the reopened spring was still running beneath the ice. By March, 29 calves stood in the south pasture. The banknote was paid 9 days late, but it was paid in full. And the ranch that had seemed 1 dry month away from failure entered spring with 49 healthy cattle, a working cistern, a rebuilt barn, and 3 people who no longer measured tomorrow by how easily they could leave. Silas never made a grand proposal. He did not buy a ring he could not afford or kneel in front of half the county. One April evening he placed a small iron key beside Abigail's plate. "What is this?" she asked. "Bunkhouse key, you already have one. This is the extra." He set a second key beside Nora's plate, then a third beside his own. "I thought the house should have 3. Abigail looked at him. "That is not how keys work." "I know. I am better with pumps." Nora covered her mouth to hide a laugh. Silas grew serious. "I came here because a woman at a mercantile said you needed a husband. Mrs. Pritchard says many dangerous things. The truth is, I needed work. Nora needed a roof. And both of us needed a place where staying was not something we had to apologize for." Abigail's eyes burned. Silas continued. "You did not need a man to save this ranch. You were saving it before I arrived. But I would be honored to stand beside you while we keep saving it." Nora leaned forward. "Is that the husband part?" Abigail laughed through her tears. "I believe it is. Then say yes." He has been practicing that speech in the barn for 6 days. Silas looked betrayed. "You promised." "I promised not to tell before supper." Abigail took the iron key from the table. "Yes," she said. Silas exhaled as though he had been holding his breath since Kansas. Nora climbed onto both their laps at once. The blue tea tin slipped from her hands and fell open on the floor. 3 pearl buttons rolled beneath the table. The yellow ribbon landed beside Abigail's boot, and the hard piece of bread from that first night broke cleanly in 2. Nora looked down at it. For more than half her life she had carried that bread as proof that safety could disappear. Abigail picked up both pieces. "You do not need this anymore." Nora thought for a moment. Then she carried the bread outside and crumbled it across the porch rail for the birds. Later that night, Abigail stood in the kitchen doorway. Silas was repairing a harness by the stove. Nora had fallen asleep at the table with one hand around her new house key. There were 3 chairs beneath the lamplight, 3 bowls drying by the basin, 3 coats on the pegs beside the door. The ranch had survived drought, fire, debt, and snow. But that was not the miracle. The miracle was smaller. A frightened child had arrived believing every meal might be her last in that house. A tired man had arrived believing love was something he had to earn with labor. And a guarded woman had spent years believing an empty house was safer than an open heart. None of them were saved by a promise made on the porch. They were saved by the promises kept afterward. The stranger had come asking whether Abigail needed a husband. What she needed was the courage to stop sending love away. And what Nora needed was a home where no one ever counted the extra chair.